Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my very special guest today is Anas Alhajii, PhD economist, energy expert, writer, and keynote speaker, who's one of my very favorite follows on Twitter and Substack. Anas, how are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Yeah, we were talking before we started recording, and I really love your Twitter feed. It's so
Thank you.
Your commentary is so pointed, and the information you share every day, it's just this wealth of information that really tips me off to an awful lot of things happening in the energy market. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to start actually with a tweet you published on April 2nd, because it covers so much in such a short little statement here. And it says 4 groups you should not waste your time with. 1, oil price narrative pushers. 2, oil peakers. 3, dollar doomsayers. And 4, climate change extremists. So these are a lot of stuff right there, you know, and a lot of it's controversial. But I just want to start with the peak oil people, because I have spent so much time over the last 10, 15 years ridiculing them for being wrong about everything, whether it's peak oil supply or peak oil demand. And so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your views on peak oil theory and whether it's supply or demand related.
The reason why I wrote this tweet, because those groups, you are not going to find anyone, regardless of the evidence, regardless of the discussion, you are not going to find anyone even giving you the chance to present your case in full or change position, regardless of the evidence. And one of them are those who believe in peak oil production. And
Right.
Probably the best way to explain this is to tell a story, because this story is extremely important and it did really shape my thinking. I had the honor of having lunch with Colin Campbell. And it just happened by coincidence, by the way. It wasn't by design. And we started talking. And of course, Colin Campbell is the father of peak oil. He wrote several books and he really mentored a lot of people. And he made a career out of it after he retired. And almost everyone who are among the leaders of the peak oil movement made another career out of it after retirement. And while we are discussing this, I told him, I said, okay, for 40 years you worked for the oil industry and you kept your mouth shut. And now after you retired, you started talking about peak oil. So which Colin Campbell I'm going to believe? The previous 40 years or the Colin Campbell, the guy in front of me? And he said, well, we couldn't talk because, you know, at Shell, if, you know, we fear that we would be fired. I said, okay, here is the problem. M. King Hubbard was not fired. And he is the one who came up with the ideas while he was working at Shell.
Right, yeah.
Okay, we don't have any evidence that a single person who talked about peak oil got fired. And then he started talking about conspiracy theory. And I said, okay, so you have all those secret information that no one has, but between the Saudis and the CIA and the White House, etc. But you don't have any evidence to support it. If it's secret, how did you get it? And he looked at me and he said, well, you are still too young, son. I think that tells the whole story.
It does. And you know, I just get so tired of it. It pops up periodically. And in my view, anyway, I think the whole theory kind of thing got co-opted along about 2008, 2009 by the anti-fracking movement and the climate change folks. And it's become this tool of trying to downplay the oil and gas industry and to convey an impression that it's declining, you know, in the interests of moving forward with, you know, what we're now calling an energy transition to renewables. And
I'm going to ask you a question, David.
Yeah.
Do you know when was the first call about the the end of oil was made?
I did some research several years ago and traced peak oil statements all the way back to 1886, but you may even have an earlier year than that.
Yes. Oil, as you know, was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859.
Right.
The first calls for the end of oil, not peak, end of oil, 1860.
That doesn't surprise me. I first really started following the oil and gas business when I was in college in the late 1970s during the Jimmy Carter administration. When the experts at the Department of Energy, which had just been created, were telling us we're going to run out of oil by 1990 or 1995. And so it's always been kind of a comical source of entertainment for me. And I'm glad we feel the same way about it, apparently.
Well, there is one thing, basically, I would like to mention for the audience, because I think this is very important regarding the late Matt Simmons.
Yes.
I've seen the first draft of the book, which was written 3 years earlier than the publication.
Yeah, Twilight in the Desert.
And it was a horrible piece that I will not accept even from my students. And I did urge him. I met him at a hotel in Mexico City. And I did urge him. I said, what you are doing, I know you have the money. I know you can publish the book, but this is unpublishable. And then, of course, he ended up talking to the Saudis, and the Saudis met with him at the CSIS in Washington, D.C. That was a big problem there, because I wrote an article that angered a lot of people at Aramco, because in a sense, I told them, think about it in this picture, that don't be to him what Khomeini was to Salman Rushdie. Okay, Salman Rushdie was completely unknown until Khomeini issued the death sentence, and all of a sudden, President Clinton will receive him at the White House. So I said, don't be to him like Khomeini to Salman Rushdie. They get angry. They said, this is not your business, etc. And then I got apologies a few years later from some of the VPs. But the issue here is when they met at the CSIS, and what the Aramco group did not pay attention to, that he was speaking fear.
Right.
While they were coming up with all the numbers and all the geology things and all the science and all, it doesn't matter. When you have fear versus something else, fear will always win. So based on that, they lost. So after they left the meeting, journalists, mostly they were siding with Matt Simmons. So a journalist was talking to the head of the Saudi delegation, and he said, well, you guys are lying and this and this. And the guy looked at him and said, okay, so why you believed him? He said, he read 200 SPE papers. You are accusing him that he is not an expert, because he is not a geologist. He's not a petroleum engineer. He's a business person. He said, but he read 200 papers. And he said, okay, that's easy. Now I'm going to read 200 papers in neurology, and let me operate on your grandmother.
Well, Simmons could be very persuasive. I actually interacted with him during that period of time when he was researching that book, and we were working on a National Petroleum Council study on natural gas. And at dinner one night, he had a table full of executives from the industry, just held their rapt attention as he explained to them how the Saudis were running out of oil and all the wells were going to play out and they were watering up. And
do you know why? Because one of the main criticisms I told him, and I was frank with him, I told him, if you go with this, I'm going to talk about it publicly, because he chose 1976 as a base year.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the whole idea is based on 19. If you change that base, the whole thing collapses.
Right, it's like climate change theory, right? If you change the
why
here.
Correct. So why it's 1976? Because OPEC in 1968 advised its members, look, you got to own some of that oil that you are contracting to the foreigners. So we've seen Libya and Iraq basically nationalizing their assets, and the Saudis and the UAE and others asking the companies to buy shares from them. And the companies have the feeling that, as some experts said at that time, there is no tomorrow. So get out. So what they did is they did not invest a penny. All they did basically is how much I can extract until the last moment. And 3-4 years without any investment, just extraction. Okay. And then in 1976, that was the bottom when they completely left and there was nothing else. And Chevron basically got the information from Chevron. He got the information from 1976 after all those years in decline. If he looked at 1980 or start from 1981 or 1982, he will get a completely different picture.
Completely different.
Or if he starts from the 60s, for example, or something like this. But that's why in the literature we call it the change in property rights. At that period, we have this change in property rights that affected the numbers, but you cannot use them to claim that the peak of oil is going to be in this year because of those numbers.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about this all day, but I want to get into the petrodollar. This which is another part of that tweet. You say don't pay attention to the dollar doomsayers, and of course we're seeing all these stories in the media here in recent weeks about Saudi Arabia, China, Russia.
Yeah, let me go over those stories one by one, because I think it's very important to clarify those stories. The last story we had was yesterday, which we covered in our daily energy report yesterday.
Yeah, give the web address for that right quick so everyone knows.
It is on Substack. It is on Substack. They can just search my name or go over my Twitter feed and they will see all the links. We have a weekly Substack, and we have the daily energy report, which is like for $1.15 a day or something like that. Really kind of cheap for the whole year. But we covered this yesterday, and the idea here is this. There was a news about 10 days ago that Kenya is ditching the dollar and buying oil from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in their own currency, the Kenyan shillings. Okay. No one paid attention to. All of a sudden, yesterday morning, the social media went crazy over it. So we decided to respond to that because it became kind of a global news. The story goes like this. No one wants to supply Kenya with gasoline and diesel because they don't pay. Okay, they have no money, but they need the gasoline and diesel. So what happened is they were able to find a Saudi company to supply them with that, and the payment will take place after 6 months. There are two facts about this. First of all, it's not crude, because a lot of people started, oh, Saudis are selling their oil for Kenyan shilling. No, this is not crude. This is gasoline and diesel, which could be sourced from any other country in Africa. That's number one. Number two, the deal is in US dollars. All what happened basically is the president of Kenya was giving a talk at the stock exchange in Nairobi. And he said, we are trying to convince the sellers to accept the shillings. That's all he said. But through translation, through whatever, all of a sudden the news is they are paying a shilling. No, there is no agreement, period. So the news is fake. So that's the last
fake
one.
News.
The one before that is that CNOOC, the Chinese company, and Total, the French company Total Energy, or Total Energies, signed basically a deal. It's for the first time deal in LNG in Yuan in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. And people said, look, they are paying in Yuan. Well, the question is, the media did not report the beginning of the story. They reported only the end of it. How did that LNG get to China in the first place? Who supplied it and what they paid? Well, it was supplied by the UAE and they got paid in US dollars. And then once it entered China, they converted that to Yuan. Well, everything in international trade, that's what happens. You go to any country, the trade out overseas is in US dollar. And then once you arrive to the country, they change it to their own currency. It's not even in use. The
So
part of the
again,
news that,
it's fake news, right? Or at least a
I mean,
non-story.
the only news about it is being done on the exchange.
Right.
That's really the news. But the idea of Yuan, basically, this is just a joke, because they paid for it in US dollar. The other piece of news is the headline that we had at the beginning of last week. The headline says China and Brazil signed a deal to deal in national currencies, and some of the doomsdayers basically, so look, things are changing. Well, I already posted in our Substack newsletter. I posted 2 headline news, exactly the same wording, the same headline, from 2009 and from 2013. And nothing happened since then. So why this one is different? Okay. And not only that, basically, when you talk about Brazil and China, when they say currency, why the Chinese will hold a Brazilian real, a country that is marred by all kind of politics, and all kind of corruption. So that means it could be only one-sided story in this case, if it happens. Now let's go back to the Saudis. The president of China visits Saudi Arabia, and there were certain things they talked about, of course. And then in his speech, basically, he mentioned that I call on the Arab nations to use our own currency. That's it. That's all he said, and nothing else. Some people took that and said, look, they are talking about this and this and this. I can tell you the issue of currency never came up in the negotiations, never came up in any meeting. This came up in the press conference at the end, but it never came up during his 2-day visit to the region and meeting the other nations. Before that, there was a report by the Wall Street Journal saying that the Saudis want to use the Yuan. That was a false report. And it does not make sense in the first place. Why? Because the Saudi riyal is pegged to the dollar.
Right.
Why they need to destroy the dollar and shoot themselves in the foot?
Yeah, and that's the part that really doesn't make sense really for China either, right?
Okay.
Because China's a big holder of US debt right now.
Correct. So, and then if you want to go farther than that, there was an article, that's absolutely true. There was a prominent journalist who wrote an article about, look, if the United States does this to us, we can do this. Okay, so there was an article, but guess what? No one said that. This guy got fired the second day and disappeared. Anyway, the whole idea here, and this is, I know we don't have enough time, the dollar is still a king. If you look, and I posted some charts on Twitter and on the Substack, one chart basically showing what the central banks around the world are holding. 60% today, this is up to last month, 60% of the holdings of the central banks around the world is US dollar. How much Yuan, Chinese currency, they are holding? 2.5%, and most of it in the Russian central bank.
And so isn't that a key point, right? I mean, if the dollar were to, if people were to suddenly stop using the US dollar in international trade, the impacts wouldn't just be on the United States and its economy. The impacts would be felt by every institution and country that's holding a very significant amount of US dollars right now, wouldn't it? I mean,
absolutely. But their idea, basically, every time you provide data, they will say, well, look, if we have a change to other currency, everything else will change with it. The idea, in theory, what they are saying is absolutely correct. But here is the issue. If you study the history of currencies worldwide and the international currency, you find out that the world reserve currency, that we call it reserve, is tied to the power of the empire, not tied to the existence of other currencies. So the sterling lost its power when we have a Great Britain, and now it is Britain. That great is gone. When Britain came back to be an island, not a global power. So this currency is tied to the empire and its power, not to the existence of other currencies, because even when the sterling was something around the world, there were other currencies all over. And no one said, well, the sterling is losing power. So even if you go throughout history, it is tied to the empire, not tied to the existence of other currencies. The final point is about the BRICS. When you talk about BRICS and they say, well, now they are going to create their own currencies. Here is the argument. European countries were developed countries in the 40s and 50s. They were really developed. They were on top of the world. And it took them 40 years to create the euro. They are on the same continent. They are neighbors. They have almost, in a sense, they have different ethnicities and different languages. But in terms of culture, the Western culture is almost the same. Okay. And they have democracies, etc., etc., etc. Yet it took them 40 years to get the currency. And yet the UK left and Italy is threatening to leave.
Right.
How in the world you are going to bring countries like India and Asia and Brazil and Latin America? We know their status of development. We know they are completely different cultures, different thinking, different, and they are going to come up with a currency tomorrow and apply it. Okay. And I mentioned something on Twitter space the other day, and some people got angry, although I did not name any countries. Those countries in BRICS, some of them, 40% of the population do not have toilets in their homes.
Right.
So compare that to Europe in the 50s when they started talking about the euro, where they were and where those guys are. And yet we are going to get a currency that's going to kill the dollar tomorrow. Aside from that, and this is a true story, okay? Go on Twitter and write something. People can have even the misconception that it is negative about India, since India is one of the leaders of BRICS.
Right.
Okay, just or write a negative tweet about the government of India right now. You will see that thousands of people are going to attack you viciously. Why? Because they are extremely nationalistic. And now those nationalists who rule India today are going to accept the order of a bank, of a central bank based in Brazil or Saudi Arabia or others. I mean, for God's sake, the British refused to get it.
Well, but that brings me to another topic. Okay, so Saudi Arabia and the relationship with the United States. And I have to say that I do see and feel that our country's relationship with Saudi Arabia is kind of fraying at the edges here in recent years. But of course, it's always ebbed and flowed over time, depending on circumstances. But do you have any real concerns about Chinese influence in the Middle East? I mean, we just had this announcement that Saudi and Iran are reestablishing diplomatic relations in this deal brokered not by our country but by China. And it does seem that going back to the fist bump last summer and the president's refusal to shake the hand of the crown prince, that insult has seemed to have had some ramifications in terms of a weakening in our country's, America's ability to influence Saudi Arabia's, this latest
well,
cut
the
in
fact
oil
the
production
fact
seems
is
to indicate that.
the fact is that the moment, I mean, this started with President Trump, and of course there were some roots in the Obama administration too. When you
Right.
start withdrawing from the global power,
Right.
you create a vacuum, and because you create a vacuum, regional powers basically are going to take over. So there were two forces here that led to the rise of Saudi Arabia, and no one can deny that. They are part of the G20. Okay, and the rise of Saudi Arabia basically it came from both sides. They were trying, they have a new vision, a new leadership, etc. They want to rise. At the same time, we have the withdrawal of the United States from the region, so they expanded. And of course, with their expansion, there were other expansion on the other side of the Gulf from Iran. So they, I mean, almost the conflict was natural in this case. The role of China basically remains limited because it is really limited to the economics of it. But
Right.
when it comes to economics, don't believe for a moment that China is going to stand up for human rights or morality or anything else to sacrifice money for it. They are not going to do that. Money first.
Right.
But they have no military power. The military power is still for the United States. So the best way, in my view, to understand the Saudi-American relationship is this. The bond is very strong and old, and the roots are all over the place. It's not only with Republicans, basically, even with Democrats. So
Right.
the best way to understand it is think about it as within the United States, we have the deep state, and then we have whoever in the White House.
Yeah.
Okay. The deep state will always have this big influence, and they will always deal with Saudi Arabia, no matter what. Okay. Those guys on top, they can kind of color that relationship in various ways, etc. For the Saudis, they can wait for 4 years for change in presidency. They can wait 8 years for change in presidency. But if you look at the leadership in Saudi Arabia, they are, as you know, absolute monarchs, and they can
Yes.
stay in power for 30 and 40 and 50 years. So they can see several presidents.
Yes. How old is the crown prince right now? 35.
I think
Right.
that I
Very
don't know
young
exactly,
man. I
but that
mean,
correct,
yeah.
correct. But the idea is they can wait, literally, they can wait Biden and all the problems that being caused because of that. I'm not defending them, but I'm just explaining their behavior and
Oh
how they
yeah.
are reacting. The
No,
other
I
issue,
understand that they're rational. I mean, it's very rational actors. I actually kind of view China in the same way. I mean, they can plan long term. They can outweigh any United States administration, and they're rational actors in their own national
and that's
interest.
bring us back to the dollar.
Right.
You don't tell me, okay, bring your investment here and invest here so you can be as part of our whatever. And then the second day you have something in Congress basically to sue me for. Okay, I'm not going to bring my investment.
Right.
I mean, you have JASTA that was passed by the Congress and the Senate by majority, and President Obama refused to sign it, but it became law anyway. Okay, and now we have an OPEC. So you cannot tell them, you know, bring the petrodollars here to the United States, etc., while you are going to sue them and confiscate their money.
Yes, obviously. But in your view, the petrodollar is not going anywhere. Correct?
It is. I mean, the dollar will remain king no matter what. Oil. We did not have time to talk about oil and the dollar shortly. Oil is priced in US dollar no matter what.
Right.
And those who claim that, well, look, we have Shanghai exchange and they use the Yuan. That's absolutely correct. But if you do the statistical analysis, whatever happened on daily basis in the Shanghai stock exchange in the Yuan is a mirror image of what happened in the dollar trading in Dubai. It's just a mirror image once you adjust for the quality and the timing. So oil is priced in US dollar. However, the oil producers can price their oil in US dollar, but they can receive revenues in other currencies. So what we see here is, and that's what happened historically, countries that suffered from sanctions are switching, and their switch is rational, because if there are sanctions and they cannot trade with the United States, why do they need the dollar?
Right.
But the idea here is, I'm speaking academically here, and this is an academic point, that we need to see completely independent countries with no trade wars, with no sanctions, on their own, ditching the dollar and moving somewhere else. You are not going to find a single country doing that.
Right. And I completely agree with that. I do think there are some issues, but most of them have to do with very temporary considerations, temporary politics, and hard feelings.
May
over
I
some
tell
other
you
things.
something, because the audience, I think, will laugh about this.
Okay. This is
Okay.
last thought.
We, the United States, impose sanctions on Iran. Then we give them exemption to supply Iraq with gasoline, natural gas, and electricity. And what Iran gets US dollars from the Iraqi oil sales that's been sold for US dollars. That's number one. Number two, until today, the EU and the United States still import enriched uranium from Putin. Until today. And what Putin gets? Euro and dollar.
Yep. And nobody wants to talk about that. We're not supposed to talk about that, Anas.
Well, we just did, right?
Yeah, we just did. I talk about all sorts of things on this show that I'm not supposed to talk about. Listen, this has been fantastic. We are up against time. We need to do this again and make it a
anytime.
thing.
Let's do it live while we are all together.
Yeah, hey, that'd be a great thing. That would be awesome, actually. Hey, thank you so much. Have
You're
a great
welcome.
week.
Have a great day.
And that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.